As a result of the night's successes, which Bismarck didn't discourage, I had a raging headache and a heaving stomach on the morning of my departure from Schönhausen. So I remember very little of it, which is no loss. For that matter, my recollections of the journey north to Strachens are hazy too. I've travelled too far in my time to be anything but bored by it, and there was nothing to see that I recall except flat snowy fields, the occasional village, and bleak woodlands of bare black trees. Rudy was full of spirits as usual, and de Gautet was his smooth civil self, but I knew he wouldn't forget or forgive that Schlager thrust in the guts. I hadn't forgotten the 2 cuts I owed him either, so we were even there. He never referred to our encounter, but now and then in the coach I would catch his dark eyes on me, and then they would slide away, looking anywhere but at me. He was one who wouldn't be sorry of the excuse to draw a bead on my back if I tried to run for it. Following Bismarck's lead, both of them had dropped the pretence of calling me Highness. Bersonin's theory, as Bismarck had called it, being well enough in my training period, I suppose, but now considered unnecessary. But they lost no chance of lecturing me on such subjects as the geography of Strachens, the ceremonial forms of its court, and the details of the wedding ceremony. I suppose I took it all in, for there was nothing else to do, but it is all gone now. We were 3 days on the road, and the last afternoon of the journey took us deep into forest country, all ghostly and silent under the snow. It was very beautiful and solemn, with never a soul to be seen along the rough track winding among the trees, until about 4 in the afternoon we stopped in a little clearing where a small hut stood, with thin smoke wreathing up from its chimney into the steely sky. There were 2 or 3 brisk-looking fellows in peasant clothes to rub down the horses and usher us into the cottage. Not that I took them for peasants, for I heard 2 of them in talk with Rudy. They were gentlemen, by German standards, but tough, active customers for all that, the kind who'd cut your throat and send back the wine at dinner afterwards. We had a meal, Rudy and I, while de Gautet paced up and down and peered out at the darkening sky and consulted his watch and fidgeted generally until Rudy told him to leave off and made him sit down and have a glass of wine with us. I was getting fairly twitchy myself as the hours passed, and Rudy gave me a stiff brandy to steady me. 3 hours from now, says he, and you'll be tucked up in a silk nightgown with C.G. embroidered on it. God, I wish I was in your shoes. How many commoners have a chance to be royalty? I'll show you one who's ready to resign his crown any time, says I. The shivers were beginning to run up my spine. Nonsense, give you 2 days, and you'll be behaving as though you'd been born to the purple. Issuing royal decrees against virginity, probably. What time is it, de Gautet? We should be moving. I heard the strain in his voice. Hey-ho, says Rudy, stretching. He was as cool as though he was off for an evening stroll. Come along, then. There was a slight altercation just before setting out, when de Gautet, officiously helping me into my cloak, discovered the pistols in the pockets. I'd had them concealed in a pair of boots in my baggage at Schönhausen, and was determined that they were going with me. Rudy shook his head. Royalty don't carry side-arms, except for ceremony. I do, says I. Either they go with me, or I don't go at all. What good do you suppose they'll be, man? None, I hope. But if the worst happens, they'll perhaps buy me a little elbow room. De Gautet was in a sweat to be off, so in the end Rudy cursed and grinned and let me keep them. He knew I wouldn't be fool enough to make a bolt for it now. With de Gautet leading, Rudy and I behind, and 2 of the others in the rear, we struck out through the trees, plodding ankle-deep through the snow. It was still as death all round, and hellish dark, but de Gautet led on unerringly for perhaps 1/4 of an hour, when we came to a high stone wall running across our front. There was a wicket, and then we were skirting past a thicket of high bushes which, by their regular spacing, must be in the garden of some great estate. Even in the darkness I could make out the level sweep of lawn under the snow, and then ahead of us were the blazing lights of a huge mansion, surrounded by terraces and hedged about by avenues of clipped bushes. De Gautet strode noiselessly up one of these, with us hard on his heels. There were stone steps rising to a wing of the house that seemed to be in darkness, and then we were clustered round a small doorway under a great stone lintel, and Rudy was softly whistling, of all things, Malbrook s'en va en guerre. For a few seconds we waited, breathing hoarsely like schoolboys who have robbed an orchard, and then the door opened. "There, Chad?" De Gautet went in, and we followed. There was a man in a frock coat in the dimly lit passage. He closed the door quickly behind us. The other two were still outside somewhere, and motioned us to silence. He was a tall, distinguished old file, with a beaky nose and a heavy lower lip. He had grey hair and a beard like a muffler round his jawline. He glanced keenly at me, muttered, "Donna," and turned to Rudy. "A complication. His Highness has retired early. He is already in his apartments." "Aha," thinks I, clever little Bismarck's bandobast didn't allow for this. Oh, Jesus, we're done for. "No matter," said Rudy easily. "He has 3 rooms. He can't be in all of them at once." This was gibberish to me, but it seemed to reassure Detchard. Without another word, he led us along the passage, up a stair, into a well-lighted and carpeted corridor, and round a corner to a large double door. He paused, listening, cautiously turned the handle, and peered in. A moment later we were all inside. Detchard stood for a moment, and I could hear my heart thumping like a paddle wheel. The sound of voices came softly through an adjoining door from the next room. "His Highness is in his bedchamber," whispers Detchard. Rudy nodded. "Strip," says he to me, and de Gautet bundled up my gear as I tore it off. He knotted it all in my cloak. I had just sense enough to remember my pistols and thrust them hurriedly under a cushion, and then I was standing there, mother naked, while Detchard listened with his ear to the panels of the communicating door. "Lucky little Duchess Irma," murmurs Rudy, and I saw him grinning at me. "Let's hope the real princess is royally endowed." He tipped me a mock salute, very debonair. "Bonne chance, your Highness." "Ready, de Gautet?" Together they went to the communicating door. Rudy nodded, and in a moment they had opened it and slipped through, with Detchard behind them. There was a second in which the murmur of voices sounded louder, and then the door closed, and I was left stark naked in a royal dressing-room in a German mansion, all alone and palpitating. For a moment there wasn't a sound, and then something tumbled next door. Minutes passed, a door was shut somewhere, there was a muttering of voices in the corridor that sent me scampering behind the curtains, and then silence. Several minutes passed, and my teeth began to chatter with cold and apprehension. At last I peeped out to see if there wasn't a gown or something to wrap up in. There was plenty of furniture in the room, the main article being an enormous decorated commode. It struck me as my usual luck that whereas most royal successions lead to a throne, mine had got me nothing so far but a thunder-box, but devil a rag of clothing beyond a couple of towels. So I wrapped up in the curtain as well as I could, and waited fearfully. Then the door opened, and Detchard's voice said softly, "Wo sind Sie?" I poked my head out. He was carrying a big silk dressing-gown, thank God, and I grabbed at it, shuddering. "His Highness has left the house," says he. "Everything is in train. Is all well with you?" "Oh, splendid, except that I'm almost frozen to death. Isn't there a fire, in God's name?" "There is a stove in the bedroom," says he, and ushered me through to a splendid apartment, thickly carpeted, with a huge 4-poster bed richly curtained, and a fine stove with its doors thrown wide to warm the room. While I thawed out, Detchard stood with his grey head cocked, considering me and toying with his seals. "It is truly amazing," says he at last. "I did not believe it, but you are the same man. Wonderful." "Well, I hope the other one's warmer than I am. Haven't you any brandy?" He poured me a glass very carefully, and watched me gulp it down. "You are nervous," says he. "Naturally. However, you will have the night to accustom yourself to the novelty of your situation. His Highness retired early with a slight headache, no doubt brought on by the fatigue of his journey, so you will be undisturbed. Your host, Count von Tarlenheim, has given particular instructions. You will meet him briefly tomorrow, by the way, before we set out for the border, an amiable dotard. His Highness, or I should say, your Highness, has been quite formal with him so far, so there will be no questions asked if you are no more forthcoming tomorrow than politeness demands." "Thank God for that," says I. I wanted time to play myself in, so to speak, and the thought of chattering to a breakfast table was out of court altogether. The only people who have been close to you on the journey, apart from myself, are Dr. Ostred, your physician, and young Joseph, your valet. He's been in your service only a day, your old valet Einar having become indisposed shortly after we set out." "Convenient," says I. "Will he live?" "Of course. You're much concerned about him." He turned, and I leapt violently as the door opened, and a little anxious-looking chap came in. "Ah, Ostredd," says Detchard, and the little chap blinked, looked at me, at Detchard, and back at me again. "I thought," he stammered, "that is, your pardon, Highness, I supposed you had retired, that you would be in bed." He looked helplessly to Detchard, and I thought, by heaven, he thinks I'm the real man. He couldn't make out what had gone wrong, so here was a first-rate chance to put the thing to the test. If I could fool my own doctor, I could fool anyone. "I have a headache," says I, quite gently. "That doesn't mean that I have to take to my bed." No, of course not, Highness." He licked his lips. "Perhaps you might take his Highness's pulse, Doctor," says Detchard, and the little fellow came over and took my wrist as though it were made of porcelain. There were beads of sweat on his brow. "A little swift," he muttered, and glanced at my face. He was scared and puzzled, and then he literally leapt back as though he had seen a ghost. He exclaimed, pointing. "No, Ostredd," says Detchard, "he is not Sir Prince." "But—" the little doctor gargled speechlessly, and I couldn't help laughing. "But he is identical. Dear Jesus, I could not believe it. I was sure when I saw him that something had gone amiss, that it was still the Prince. My God!" "What gave him away?" asks Detchard. "The scars. They are new and pink." Detchard snapped his teeth in annoyance. "The scars, of course I had forgotten. That might have cost us dear. However, we have the means to put it right." And he took out a flask which I suppose Rudy had given him, and daubed at my wounds until he and the doctor were satisfied. "There," says Detchard. "When did you last shave your head?" "Last night." "It will do for the moment. Ostredd will attend to it again tomorrow." He pulled out his watch. "No, it may be best if you and I, Doctor, return to our hosts." For my benefit he rattled off a few more details about Tarlenheim and the arrangements for the morning. "Your valet will look in shortly to see you to bed," he continued. "You may sleep easily, believe me. Now that I have seen you, my doubts are at rest. I seriously question if your own father would detect the imposture." "You see," I said, "your own father." He smiled grimly. "I half believe in you myself. And so, your Highness, I have the honour to bid you good night." They withdrew, bowing, and left me trembling. But for once it wasn't funk. I was elated. I had fooled Ostredd. By God, it was going to work. I took a turn round the room, grinning to myself, drank another glass of brandy, and another, and stood beaming at myself in the mirror. "Well, Prince Harry, thinks I, if only Elspeth could see you now, and old Moneybags Morrison, and Lord God Almighty Cardigan. He'd be glad enough to have royalty back in his flea-bitten 11th Hussars, for I was royal for the moment. A full-blown Prince of the Blood, no less, until Bismarck's little game was played out. And then— oh, the blazes with him! I had another glass of brandy, and took stock of my royal surroundings. Sumptuous wasn't the word for them. Silk sheets, lace pillows, solid silver cup and plate by the bed, with breast of chicken under a napkin, by God, in case I felt peckish. I resisted a temptation to slip the plate into a pocket. Plenty of time for lifting the lumber later. This was only a staging post on the journey, after all. The pick of the loot would be in the Palace of Strakians. But I felt I could rough it here for the night. Excellent liquor, a warm fire, cigars in a tooled leather box. Even the pot under the bed was of the best china, with little fat-ass cherubs running round it. I plumped back on the bed. It was like floating on a cloud. Well, thinks I, they may talk about cares of state, and uneasy lies the head, and all that tommy-rot, but this is the life for old Flashy. You may take my word for it, next time you hear about the burdens of monarchy, that royalty do themselves damned proud. I've been one, I know. My eye fell on an ornament on the mantel, a carved kneeling figure. A little prickle ran through me as I realized that this was the Cupid Bismarck had mentioned. By Jove, he knew his business, that one. Down to the last detail. I rolled off the bed and looked at it, and felt a slight glow of pleasure as I realized it wasn't a Cupid, after all. It was a nymph. The great Otto wasn't infallible, then, after all. It was most obviously a nymph, and contemplating it I realized there was one thing missing from my princely paradise. bronze nymphs don't compare to real ones. I hadn't had a woman since the blubbery Baroness Pechmann had been so rudely plucked from my embrace, and I hadn't really been able to get to proper grips with her before Rudy had interrupted us. Fat and all as she was, the thought of her was making me feverish. And at that moment there was a soft tap at the door, and a slim, very sober-looking fellow slipped in. This was obviously Joseph, my valet. I was on guard again in a moment. "Is there anything your Highness requires?" says he. "I don't think so, Joseph," says I, and gave a yawn. "Just going to bed." And then a splendid idea occurred to me. "You may send up a chambermaid to turn down the covers." He looked surprised. "I can do that, sir." Now, Flashy would have growled, "Damn your eyes, do as you're bloody well told," but Prince Karl Gustav merely said, "No, send the chambermaid." He hesitated a second, his face expressionless. Then, "Very good, your Highness." He bowed and went to the door. "Good night, Highness." Of course it was a damn fool thing to do, but what with the brandy and my randy thoughts, I didn't care. Anyway, wasn't I a prince? And the real Karl Gustav was no monk by all accounts, and damn careless about it too. So I waited in lustful anticipation until there was another knock, and a girl peeped in when I called out to enter. She was a pretty plump little thing, curly-haired and as broad as she was long, but just the thing for me with my thoughts running on Baroness Pechmann. She had a bright eye, and it occurred to me that Joseph was perhaps no fool. She curtsied and tripped across to the bed, and when I sauntered over, slipping the door-bolt on the way, and stood beside her, she giggled and made a great show of smoothing out my pillow. "All work and no play isn't good for little girls," says I, and sitting on the bed, I pulled her onto my knee. She hardly resisted, only trying to blush and look demure, and when I pulled down her bodice and kissed her breasts, she cooed and wriggled her body against mine. In no time we were thrashing about in first-rate style, and I was making up for weeks of enforced abstinence. She was an eager little bundle, all right, and by the time she'd slipped away, leaving me to seek a well-earned rest, I was most happily played out. I sometimes wondered what the result of that encounter was, and if there is some sturdy peasant somewhere in Holstein called Karl who puts on airs in the belief that he can claim royal descent. If there is, he can truly be called an ignorant bastard. There are ways of being drunk that have nothing to do with alcohol. For the next few days, apart from occasional moments of panic-stricken clarity, I was thoroughly intoxicated. To be a king, well, a prince, is magnificent. To be fawned at and deferred to and cheered and adulated, to have every wish granted, no, not granted, but attended to immediately by people who obviously wish they had anticipated it, to be the centre of attention, with everyone bending their backs and craning their necks and loving you to ecstasy, it is the most wonderful thing. Perhaps I'd had less of it than even ordinary folk, especially when I was younger, and so appreciated it more. Anyway, while it lasted, I fairly wallowed in it. Of course, I'd had plenty of admiration when I came home from Afghanistan, but that was very different. Then they'd said, "There's the heroic Flashman, the bluff young lionheart who slaughters niggers and upholds old England's honour. Gad, look at those whiskers," which was splendid, but didn't suggest that I was more than human. But when you're royalty, they treat you as though you're God. You begin to feel that you're of entirely different stuff from the rest of mankind. You don't walk, you float, above it all, with the mob beneath, toadying like fury. I had my first taste of it the morning I left Tarlenheim, when I breakfasted with the Count and about 40 of his crowd, goggling gentry and gushing females, before setting out. I was in excellent shape after bumping the chambermaid and having a good night's rest, and was fairly gracious to one and all, even to old Tarlenheim, who could have bored with the best of them in the St. James's clubs. He remarked that I looked much healthier this morning. The solicitor's inquiries after my headache would have put a royal commission on the plague to shame, and, encouraged, I suppose, by my geniality, began to tell me what a hell of a bad harvest they'd had that year. German potatoes were in a damnable condition, it seemed. However, I put up with him, and presently, after much hand-kissing and bowing and clanking of guardsmen about the driveway, I took my royal leave of them, and we bowled off by coach for the Strachan's border. It was a fine bright day, with snow and frost all over the place, but warm enough for all that. My coach was a splendid machine, upholstered in grey silk, excellently sprung, and with the Danish royal arms on the panels. I remembered that the coach Wellington had once taken me in looked like a public cab, and rattled like a wheelbarrow. There were cuirassiers bumping along in escort, smart enough, and a great train of other coaches bringing up the rear. I lounged and had a cheroot while Detchard assured me how well things had gone, and would continue to go. He needn't have bothered, for I was in an exalted state of confidence. And then presently we rolled through our first village, and the cheering began. All along the road, even at isolated houses, there were smiling faces and fluttering handkerchiefs, squires and peasants, farm girls and ploughmen, infants waving the red and white Danish colours and the curious thistle-like emblem which is the badge of Holstein, labourers in their smocks staring, mounted officials saluting. The whole countryside seemed to have converged on the Strakens road to see my Royal Highness pass by. I beamed and waved as we rushed past, and they hallooed and waved back all the harder. It was a glorious dream, and I was enjoying it to the full, and then Detchard reminded me dryly that these were only Holsteiners, and that I might save some of my royal energy for the Strakensians. It was at the border, of course, that the real circus began. There was a great crowd waiting, the toffs to the fore and the mob craning and hurrahing at a more respectful distance. I stepped out of the coach, at Detchard's instruction, and the cheers broke out louder than ever, the crashing threefold bark that is the German notion of hip-hip-hooray. An elderly cove with snow-white hair, thin and hobbling stiffly, came forward, bowing and hand-kissing, to bid me welcome in a creaking voice. "Marshal von Salden, Constable of Strakens," whispered Detchard, and I grasped the old buffer's hand while he gushed over me and insisted that this was the greatest day in Strakens' history, and welcome, thrice welcome, Highness. In turn I assured him that no visitor to Strakens had ever arrived more joyfully than I, and that if their welcome was any foretaste of what was to come, then I was a hell of a fortunate fellow, or words to that effect. They roared and clapped at this, and then there were presentations, and I inspected a guard of honour of the Strakens Grenadiers, and off we went again, with von Salden in my coach, to point out to me some objects of interest, like fields and trees and things. The old fellow was as jumpy as a cricket, I realised, and babbled like anything, which I accepted with royal amiability. And then he had to leave off so that I could devote myself to waving to the people who were now lining the road all the way, and in the distance there was the sound of a great throng and a tremendous bustle. Far away guns began to boom in salute, and we were rolling through the suburbs of the city of Strakens itself. The crowds were everywhere now, massed on the pavements, waving from the windows, crouching precariously on railings, and all yelling to beat the band. There were flags and bunting and thumping of martial music, and then a great archway loomed ahead, and the coach rolled slowly to a halt. The hubbub died away a little, and I saw a small procession of worthies in robes and flat caps approaching the coach. Ahead was a stalwart lad carrying a cushion with something on it. "The keys to the city," quavered von Salden, "for your Highness's gracious acceptance." Without a thought I opened the door and jumped down, which I gather was unexpected, but was a happy act as it turned out. The crowds roared at the sight of me, the band began booming away, and the little burgomaster took the keys, huge heavy things on an enormous collar, and begged me to accept them as an earnest of the loyalty and love of the city. "Your city, Highness," he squeaked, "and your home." I knew enough to say that I was deeply sensible of the great honour done me, and to give him the keys back again. And being somewhat exalted, I felt it appropriate to slip my sword-belt over my head, present the weapon to him, and say that it would be ever ready in the defence of Strakensian honour and independence, or some such stuff. I didn't know it, but that brief speech had an enormous political implication. The Danish Strakensians being in a great sweat about the German threat to their liberty, and the German Strakensians bursting to get away from Danish sovereignty. Anyway, the yell of applause that greeted it was startling. The little burgomaster went red with emotion, and taking the sword he pressed it back on me, tears in his eyes, and calling me the champion of Strakensian freedom. I don't know which side he was on, but it didn't seem to matter. I believe if I'd shouted "Chairs to mend," they'd have cheered just as loud. I was then invited to enter the city, and it seemed a good notion to me to ride in on horseback, rather than go in the coach. There was delight and confusion at this. Orders were shouted, officers scampered to and fro, and then a cavalryman led forward a lovely black gelding, speed written in every line of him, and I mounted amid scenes of enthusiasm. I must have looked pretty fine, if I say it myself. They had dressed me that morning all in pale blue, with the blue sash of the Order of the Elephant over my shoulder. I've worn it in the last few years, by the way, at London functions, to the surprise and scandal of the Danish embassy, who wondered where the deuce I got it. I referred them to former Chancellor Bismarck. The uniform set off my excellent stature famously, and since my disgusting bald head was covered by a plumed helmet à la Tinbellies, I've no doubt I looked sufficiently dashing. The band played, the cheering re-echoed, and I rode through the gateway into the city of Strackens. Flowers were showered from the balconies, girls blew kisses, the troops lining the streets struggled to hold back the press, and I waved and inclined my princely head left and right, and smiled on my loyal subjects-to-be. "Well, he can ride," someone called out, and a wit in the crowd shouted back, "Aye, Duchess Irma will find out all about that," at which there was some commotion. I was aware that for all the adulation and hurrahing, there were those in the crowd who stood silent, and even some who looked positively hostile. These would be the Germans, no doubt, who didn't want to see the state bound any closer to Denmark. However, they were a small minority, in the city at all events, and for the most part it was flowers and laughter all the way, with Prince Charming flashing his smile to the prettiest girls and feeling no end of a fellow. Probably because I was enjoying myself so much, it was no time at all to the town hall. I should say that Strackens isn't much of a city, being no greater than one of our market towns, although it has a cathedral and a ducal palace of some pretension. For that matter, the whole duchy isn't more than a dozen miles across by about 30 in length, having been whittled down over the centuries from a fair-sized province. But it was a perfect hotbed of nationalist emotions, German and Danish, and fiercely proud of its traditions, including its ducal house. The Danish faction were overjoyed at the impending marriage, hence their tumultuous welcome of me. At the town hall there were more dignitaries and bowing and scraping, and I was presented with an ornamental casket bearing the city's arms, and invited to sign an order for a jail clearance, it being the custom here as elsewhere to celebrate joyous occasions by letting all the hooligans and harlots out of the local clink. How this is supposed to add to the general jollity I've never understood. Furthermore, although I've been in half the lock-ups between Libby Prison and Botany Bay myself, no one has ever held a clearance that benefited me. I'm against 'em on principle, but I saw nothing for it here but to sign, until the moment I actually took the pen in my hand and realized with a fearful qualm that the one thing my instructors hadn't taught me was how to forge Carl Gustav's signature. I didn't even know what his writing looked like. Probably I could have signed my own fist and no one would ever have spotted a difference, but at the time I didn't dare risk it. For what seemed a year I hesitated, at the great burgomaster's table, with the long roll of parchment stretched out in front of me, and my pen poised, while the crowd goggled expectantly, and the little burgomaster stood waiting to pounce on my signature with the sandcaster. And then my mother wit came back to me, and I laid down the pen and said, very quietly and seriously, that before signing such a delivery, which I reminded them was a grave matter indeed, I would wish to hear a report from the judges assuring me that no malefactor who might prove a danger to the commonweal would be enlarged by the amnesty. It could wait, I said firmly, for a day or two, and added that I would find other and better ways of marking this happy occasion of my arrival. That pious old hypocrite, Arnold, my headmaster, would have loved every word of it. But there was a general air of disappointment round the table, although one or two of the toadies muttered about a prudent prince, and wagged their heads approvingly. The little burgomaster looked ready to cry, but agreed that my wishes would be met to the letter. They all cheered up, though, at the next act of the comedy, when a small child was led in to present me with a peach that they had been preparing for me in the hothouse of the local orphanage. I say led in, because the child was so lame that he had to go on little crutches, and there were sighings and affected cooings from the females present. I'm no hand with children at all, and have found them usually to be detestable, noisy, greedy little brats, but it seemed best to be monstrously pleasant to this one. So, instead of just accepting the gift, I racked my brains quickly for a touching gesture, and was inspired to pick him up, he was no size at all, and sit him on the table and talk to him, and insisted that we eat the peach between us, then and there. He laughed and cried together, and when I patted his head according to form, he fastened onto my hand and kissed it. The females were all snivelling foully by this time, and the men were looking pitying and noble. I felt ashamed, and still do. It is the only time in my life I have felt ashamed, which is why I put it on record here, and I still don't know why. Anyway, I left the town hall in a thoroughly ill temper, and when they told me that next on the programme was a visit to the local academy, I as near as not told them I'd had enough of their damned infants for one day. But I didn't, of course, and presently I was being conducted through the school by the professor, who made an oration in my honour in Greek, and then put up his best boys to construe for my entertainment. The things these honest asses imagine will delight royalty. Of course the selected pupils were the usual mealy wretches who are put up in all schools everywhere on such occasions. Pious, manly little villains of the type I used to oppress myself in happier days. Tom Brown could have made a football side out of them, I don't doubt, and had them crying, "Play up," and telling the truth fit to sicken you. So I decided on a bit of mischief, and looked to the back of the school for the local flashman. Aye, there he was, a big surly lout, biting his nails and sneering to himself. "There's a likely lad, Professor," says I. "Let's hear him construe." So, willy-nilly, they had to put the brute up, and he was paper-colour at the shock of it. Of course he floundered and grunted and glared round for inspiration, and the goody-goodies giggled and nudged each other, and the professor's frown grew blacker every minute. "Stand down, sir," says he grimly, and to me, "He shall be corrected, Highness, I assure you." "That's your sort, Professor," says I. "Lay on with a will." And I left in excellent humour. There would be a raw backside in that school by night, or I was mistaken. Mind you, I'd sooner it had happened to the clever little sneaks, but no doubt my counterpart would pass his smarts on to them in turn. The crowd still filled the streets for my final progress to the palace, which was a fine imposing pile on the outskirts of the town, with pillars and balconies and the running lion flag of Strackens floating from its roof with the Danish colours alongside. The people were jammed up to the railings, and the sweep of the drive beyond was lined with the yellow-jacketed infantry of the Duchess's guard, all in glittering back and breasts, with drawn swords. Trumpeters blew a fanfare, the crowd surged and shouted, and I cantered up the gravel to the broad palace steps. There I turned and waved for the last time, and wondered why people will make such a fuss over royalty. It's the same with us. We have our tubby little Teddy, whom everyone pretends is the first gentleman of Europe, with all the virtues, when they know quite well he's just a vicious old rake. Rather like me, but lacking my talent for being agreeable to order. Anyway, I was aboard Lily Langtry long before he was. That, by the way, all such lofty philosophical thoughts were driven from my mind when I entered the palace, for there I met the Duchess I was to marry next day in the old cathedral of Strackens. And it is a tribute to her that while I have only the haziest memories of the brilliant throng that crowded the marble staircase and great ballroom, my first glimpse of her remains fresh in my mind to this day. I can still see her, standing slim and straight on the dais at the far end of the room, with the ducal throne framed in crimson behind her, watching me as I approached, with the spectators suddenly hushed, and only the sound of my marching feet echoing through the silence. This was one of the moments when it struck me. This is all a fraud, it isn't real. Here was I, not Prince Carl Gustaf of the ancient royal house of Oldenburg, but rascally old Flashy of the vulgar and lately arrived house of Flashman, striding ahead to claim my noble bride. God, I remember thinking, the things people get me into. And that thought probably prevented me from wearing the devil-may-care leer that I normally assume in the presence of beautiful women. She was beautiful, too. Far more so than her portrait had made her out. She couldn't have been more than 20, but already she had the hard, cold loveliness that you find only among northern women, with their fine, long features looking as though they had been carved from marble. Her figure, in an ivory dress with a train that spread out behind her, was perhaps a trifle on the slim side, with a hint of boyishness about it, but everything was there, and in good parade order. She was crowned with a little silver diadem sparkling with stones, and her shining fair hair was pulled back and rolled into some kind of jewelled net behind her head. The effect of it all, so pale and pure and perfect, was rather awe-inspiring. I felt almost afraid of her. The way she looked at me didn't help matters. The grey eyes were cold and proud, and I thought, this is a spoiled, arrogant madame, if ever I saw one. Whatever her feelings might be about a duty marriage, She didn't seem to care for me at first glance. I knew she was looking at my glistening bald head, and I thought angrily what a damned shame it was I hadn't my natural adornments of curly mane and whiskers. The hand she held out for me to kiss was as pale and chilly as mist in a cemetery, and just about as welcoming. I took it, murmuring about pleasure and honour and deeply heartfelt felicitous gratification, and felt it quiver ever so slightly before it was withdrawn. So there we stood together on the dais, with me wondering what to say next, and then someone in the watching multitude began to clap, and in a moment they were crowding forward to get a closer look, I suppose, at the pair of us, and everyone was pleased and happy and clapping away like mad. I found myself grinning and nodding at them, but her Grace stood there quite serene, with never a smile, as though this was her due, and rather a bore. Well, thinks I, this is going to be a chilly wooing. And then an old cove in a frock coat with orders on his breast came bowing up beside us and turned to the throng with his hand raised for silence. This turned out to be the chief minister, one Schwerin. He made a neat little speech in which he managed to wrap up a nice complimentary welcome for me, a note of homage for the Duchess, who couldn't get too much of it, as I discovered, a patriotic boost for Strachens, coupled with the state of Denmark, and a hint to the mob to keep their distance and stay out of the buffet next door until Her Grace and I saw fit to lead the way. That was about the size of it, and the good folk, who were a very well-trained court, chattered respectfully among themselves while Schwerin brought forward the more distinguished to be presented to me. These included the various emissaries to Strachens, the British one among them, and I found myself thanking God I'd never moved in diplomatic circles at home, or he might have remembered me. As it was, he and the others made their bows, and when they had withdrawn, the Duchess indicated to me that we should sit down. We did so, both rather stiff, and while the noble assembly pretended not to notice, we began to get acquainted. It was formality carried to nonsense, of course, and if I didn't have a clear memory of our opening exchanges, I wouldn't believe them. Duchess Irma, I trust your Highness's journey has not been tedious. Flashy. Indeed, no, although I confess I have counted every moment in my impatience to be here. Duchess, your Highness is very gracious. We of Strachens can only hope that you are not too disappointed in us. We are very small and provincial here. Flashy, very gallant. No one could be disappointed who was welcomed by so beautiful and noble a hostess. Duchess, oh. Pause. Was the weather cold on your journey? Flashy, at times. Occasionally it was quite warm. Nowhere so warm, however, as I find it here. This with a flashing smile. Duchess, you are too hot? I shall order the windows opened. Flashy, Christ, no. That is, I mean the warmth of your welcome, and the people in the streets, cheering. Duchess, ah, the people. They are rather noisy. Well, I don't give up easy, but I confess I was fairly stumped here. Usually with young women I get along all too well. Formal chit-chat isn't my style. A little gallantry, a few jocularities to see if she will or she won't, a pinch on the buttocks, and off we go. Either that or off I go, but I couldn't make anything of the Duchess Irma. She kept her head tilted high and looked past me, so composed and regal, that I began to wonder, was she perhaps terrified out of her wits? But before I could take soundings on that, she rose, and I found myself escorting her into the antechamber, where great tables were laid out with silver plate and crystal, and a most scrumptious spread was served by flunkies, while a little orchestra struck up in the gallery overhead. I was sharp set, and while one of the Duchess's ladies looked after her, I laid into the ham and cold fowls, and chatted affably to the nobs and their ladies, who were making the most of the grub themselves, as the Germans always do. This kind of function normally bores me out of mind, and beyond the fact that the food was unusually excellent, and that the Duchess seemed intent on not being left alone with me for more than a moment at a time, I haven't any sharp recollection of it. I remember turning once in that gay company with its buzz of well-bred conversation, and catching her eyes fixed on me. She looked quickly away, and I thought, my God, I'm marrying that woman tomorrow. My heart took a skip at the thought. She was unutterably lovely. And then it took a lurch, as I remembered the appalling risk that I ran every moment that I was in Strachens, and wondered what the penalty might be for marrying the heir to the throne under false pretences. Death, certainly. I tried to smile politely at the eager, sycophantic faces around me, and to listen to their incredible inanities of small talk, while my mind raced away looking for a way out, even although I knew it didn't exist. I probably drank a little more than I should have done, although I was pretty careful, but at any rate the desperate feeling passed. The goodwill of the Strakensians towards me was so evident, and so fulsomely expressed, that I suppose it overcame me, and banished my fears. I found I could even talk to the Duchess without embarrassment, although it was obvious to me, if not to anyone else, that she didn't like me. She remained haughty and distant. But then she seemed to be the same to everyone, and they swallowed it and sucked up to her. Afterwards, old Schwerin and a couple of his ministerial colleagues, I forget their names, took me aside and discussed the next day's ceremony. They were fairly vague, as I remember, and gassed a good deal about the political advantage of the match and the popular satisfaction, and how it would have a good and stabilizing effect. "Her Grace is very young, of course," says old Schwerin, "very young." He gave me rather a sad smile. "Your Highness is not so very much older, but your education at a great court and your upbringing have perhaps prepared you better for what lies before you both." "You little know, old son," thinks I. "It is a great responsibility for you, but you will bear it honourably." I murmured noble nothings, and he went on. "It is much to ask of two young folk. I often feel that such marriages of state would be the better of, longer preparation. Perhaps I am a sentimentalist," says he, with a senile smirk, "but it has always seemed to me that a courtship would not be out of place, even between royal personages. Love, after all, does not come in a day." "It depends what you mean by love," thinks I. And one of the others says to Schwerin, "You have a great heart, Adolf." "I hope I have. I hope so. And your Highness, I know, has a great heart also. It will know how to understand our little Irma. She is very much like a daughter to us, you see." He was going pink about the eyes by this time. "And although she seems so serene and proud beyond her years, she is still very much a child." Well, I could agree with him that she was an unusually arrogant little bitch for her age, but I kept a princely silence. He looked almost pleading. "Your Highness," he said at last, "will be kind to our treasure." Strange, my own father-in-law had struck something of the same note before I married Elspeth. It's a polite way of suggesting that you don't make too much of a beast of yourself on the honeymoon. I assumed a look of manly understanding. "Sir," says I, "what can I say, except that I trust I shall always bear myself to your Duchess, as I would to the daughter of my oldest and dearest friend." That cheered them up no end, and presently the reception began to draw to a close, and the noble guests imperceptibly melted away. Schwerin beamed paternally on the Duchess and myself, and hinted that as the next day was going to be an exhausting one, we should take all the rest we could beforehand. It was still only early afternoon, but I was dog-tired with the novelty and excitement of the morning, and so we said our formal goodbyes to each other. I made mine as pleasant as I could, and the Duchess Irma received it with an inclination of her head, and gave me her hand to kiss. It was like talking to a walking statue. Then Detchard, who had been hovering off my port quarter for several hours, closed in, and with attendant flunkies escorted me to the suite reserved for me in the west wing of the palace. They would have made a great fuss of me, but he shooed them away. And what I thought rather odd, he also dismissed Joseph, who was waiting to unbutton me and remove my boots. However, I realized he wished us to be private, and when we passed through into my main salon, I understood why, for Rudi Starnberg and de Gotha were waiting for us. The sight of them damped my spirits. It was a reminder of what I was here for, with my custodians dogging me all the time. From being the prince, I was become play-actor Flashy again. Rudi sauntered across, and without so much as by your leave, took hold of my wrist and felt my pulse. "You're a cool hand," says he. "I watched you down below, and on my oath you looked a most condescending tyrant. How does it feel to play the prince?" I hadn't been used to this kind of talk in the last few hours, and found myself resenting it. I damned his impudence, and asked where the blazes he'd been all day, for he and de Gotha had been supposed to meet me with the others at the frontier. He cocked an eyebrow at me. "Regal airs, eh? Well, Highness, we've been busy about affairs of state, if you please. Your affairs, your state. You might show a little appreciation to your loyal servants. He grinned insolently. But, of course, the gratitude of princes is proverbial. Then don't presume on it, even with temporary royalty, I growled. You can both go to the devil. I want to rest. De Gautet considered me. A little drunk, perhaps? Damn you, get out! I do believe the infection has really taken, chuckled Rudy. He'll be calling the guard in a moment. Now, seriously, friend Flashman, and here he tapped me on the chest, you can put away your ill temper, for it won't answer. It ain't our fault if the Duchess hasn't languished at you. No, you needn't damn my eyes, but listen. Certain things have happened, which may, I say may only, affect our plans. My stomach seemed to turn to ice. What do you mean? By ill chance, one of the Danish embassy at Berlin, a fellow Hansen, a senior official, arrived today in Strachens. He was on his way home, and broke his journey here to attend the wedding. There was no convenient way to get rid of him, so he will be here tomorrow. Well, what about it, says I? There'll be plenty of Danes in the cathedral, won't there? What's one more or less? Detchard spoke from behind me. Hansen has been a friend of Carl Gustav's from childhood. Indeed, the most intimate of all his companions. Your resemblance to Carl Gustav is uncanny, put in de Gautet. But will it deceive his oldest playmate? Jesus! I sat stricken. No, no, by God it won't. It can't. He'll know me. I jumped up. I knew it. We're done for. He'll denounce me. You bloody idiots. See what you've done with your lunatic schemes. We're dead men and— Lower your voice, says Rudy, and take a grip on your nerves. He pushed me firmly back into my chair. Your mind's disordered, which is not surprising. For Sonin warned us that even a strong man may show signs of hysteria in the kind of position you're in. He's no fool, that one, is he? Cried I. What the hell can I do? He'll give me away, this Hansen, and— He will not, says Rudy firmly. Take my word for it. I can see this thing clearly, which you can't, being the principal actor, and I can tell you there's not the slightest risk, provided you keep your head. He'll meet you for a moment at the reception after the wedding, shake your hand, wish you well, and whist, that is all. He's not looking for an impostor, remember? Why should he? We would not have told you, said Detchard, if it could have been avoided, but if we had not, you might unwittingly have made some fatal blunder. That's it exactly, said Rudy. You had to be ready for him. Now, we have decided what you shall say when he approaches you in the reception line. Detchard here will be at your elbow, and will whisper, Hansen, when he reaches you. At the sight of him you'll start, look as delighted as you know how, seize his right hand in both of yours, shake it hard, and exclaim, Eric, old friend, where did you spring from? Then, whatever he says in reply, you'll give your merriest laugh and say, This is the happiest surprise of this happy day. God bless you for coming to wish me joy. And that will be all. I'll see to it that he doesn't get near you before you leave for the lodge at Strelho, where your honeymoon is being spent. And suppose he sees through me, what then? This news had left me sick with fright. Suppose he isn't to be put off with this nonsense about happy surprises, and I have to talk to him longer. I had a dreadful vision. Suppose he shouts, That's not the prince. What'll you do then? I'll have done it long before he shouts anything, says Rudy quietly. You may rely on that. I wasn't so easily reassured. My cowardly instincts were in full cry, and it took all Rudy's and Detchard's arts of persuasion to convince me that the risk wasn't so terrible. Indeed, that if I played my part properly, it was barely a risk at all. Conduct yourself as you were doing an hour ago, says Rudy, and the thing's as safe as sleep. Courage, man. The worst's past. You've pulled the wool over all the eyes of Strachens this day, and right royally, too. I thought there was even a hint of envy in his voice. All that's to do now is to stand up in church with the delightful Duchess, say your vows, and then off for a blissful idyll in your forest love-nest. Let your mind run on the pleasures of putting that dainty little pullet to bed. He nudged me and winked lewdly. I'll wager the next Duke of Strachens has fine curly whiskers, for all that his father won't have a hair on his face to bless himself with. Of course, as so often turns out, there wasn't time to be frightened. Ostrid gave me a sleeping draught that night, and in the morning it was all mad bustle and hurry, with never fewer than a dozen folk round me from the moment I rose, dressing me, pushing me, instructing me, reminding me. I felt like a prize beast in the ring as I was conducted down the great marble staircase to the waiting coach that was to carry me to the cathedral. As we paused on the steps, the sound thundered up from the waiting thousands beyond the palace railings, the cannon boomed in the park, and a great cheer rolled across the steep roofs of Straken City. "God save Prince Karl!" "Wherever he may be," muttered Rudy. "Forward, your Highness." It should have been a day to remember, I suppose, but how much of detail does one recall of one's own wedding? And it was my second, as you know. It seems now like a strange dream, driving through the packed streets in the sunshine, the roar of the people buffeting my ears, the blare of the trumpets, the clatter of hooves, and the coloured bunting fluttering bravely in the morning breeze, but what sticks in my mind is the red birthmark on the back of the coachman's head, which under his hat was as bald as my own. And then there was the sudden dimness and hush of the great cathedral, the pungent smell of the church, the soaring stained glass and the carpeted stone flags underfoot. There was the rustle as hundreds of people rose to their feet, the solemn booming of a great organ, and the hollow thud of my own footsteps on the stones. And there was the shrill sweetness of the choristers, and people softly moving to and fro about me, and the splendid figure of the Bishop of Strakenz, bearded to the eyes, and for all the world like Willie Grace, the great cricket champion nowadays. I remember standing very lonely and afraid, wondering if perhaps there was such a place as hell after all, a question which had occupied me a good deal as a small boy, especially when Arnold had been terrifying us with sermons about Kibroth Hatava, where I gathered all kinds of fornication and fun took place. Well, what I was doing in that cathedral would have ensured me a single ticket to damnation, no doubt of that. But I consoled myself with the thought that the hereafter was the last thing to worry about just then. And I remember, too, the Duchess suddenly at my side, pale and wondrously lovely in her white gown, with her golden hair crowned with a fillet of brilliant stones, and her tiny hand slipping into mine, her clear voice answering the bishop, and then my own, husky and nervous. They pressed a ring into my hand, and I fumbled it onto her tiny finger, my palms sweating, and kissed her on the cheek when the old bishop gave the word. She stood like a wax dummy, and I thought, poor old Carl Gustaf, having to live with this cold fish all his life, and the choir let go a great blast of sound as they placed the ducal coronets on our heads, and the Duchess took the gold staff of her sovereignty, and the sword of state was buckled round my waist. Then the whole congregation rose and sang a hymn of rejoicing, and various minor clergy decked us out in the remaining crown jewels. I must say that for a small state Strakenz was remarkably well off in this respect. Apart from the coronets and staff, there were rings for my fingers, and a magnificent solid gold chain set with emeralds which they hung round my unworthy neck. It had a star of diamonds pendant from it that must have weighed £half a pound. The Duchess did rather better, she being the reigning prince, while poor old Flash was just her consort. It struck me then, and it strikes me now, that the Salic law was a damned sound idea. She had a collar of solid gems, and her rings would have knocked mine all to pieces. Soldierly instinct dies hard, and as the hymn drew to a close, I was mentally computing the worth of all this jewelled splendour, and how it could best be stowed. Emerald chain in one side pocket, collar in t'other, rings and similar trifles in the fobs. The coronets would be bulky, but they could probably be bent flat for convenience, and the staff was slender enough to stick down your boot. Of course, I'd probably never have the chance to lay my itchy fingers on this magnificent collection of loot again, but it does no harm to take stock in advance. You never know what opportunities may arise. The crown jewels of the Duchy of Strakenz would have kept me and a dozen like me in tremendous style for life, and they looked eminently portable. I decided to keep them in mind. There was a final hallelujah and amen, and then we were out in the sunlight again, with the crowd deafening us and the great bells of the cathedral pealing overhead. There was an open state coach in which we rode side by side, with the Duchess's bridesmaids facing us, and I played up to the mob and waved and beamed, while my bride stirred a languid hand in their direction. She did manage a smile or two, though, and even condescended to exchange a few civilities with me, which was a great advance. Never mind, thinks I. It'll soon be ho for the hunting lodge and Beddy buys, and then we'll bring the roses back to those pearly cheeks. We drove slowly, so that the populace could get a good look at us, and their enthusiasm was so tremendous that the infantry lining the road had to link arms to hold them back. There were children waving flags and screaming, girls fluttering their handkerchiefs, fellows throwing their hats in the air, and old women sobbing and mopping at themselves. At one point the troops gave way, and the crowd clamoured right up to the coach, stretching over to touch us as though we were holy relics. If only they'd known, they'd have scampered off far enough in case they caught Flashy's evil. The Duchess wasn't too pleased at being adored so closely, and looked ahead pretty stiff, but I shook hands like a good 'un, and they cheered me hoarse. At this point there was an odd incident. Above the cheering I was aware of a voice shouting from the back of the crowd. No, not shouting, but declaiming. It was a strong, harsh trumpet of a voice, although its words were lost in the tumult, and its owner was a most odd-looking fellow, who had scrambled up onto some kind of hand-cart, and was haranguing the mob full blast. There were soldiers struggling through the press to get at him, and a knot of sturdy, sober-looking chaps round the cart, as though to shield the orator, so I gathered he must be denouncing us, or threatening a breach of the peace. He wasn't a big chap in height, but he was built like a bull across the shoulders, with a huge shaggy head and a beard like a sweep's broom. Even at that distance I could see the flashing eyes as he thundered out his message, thumping the air with his fist and laying it off like a Mississippi camp-meeting preacher full of virtue and 40-rod whiskey. The people nearest him and his group were shouting threats at him, but he kept bawling away, and it looked to me as though an excellent brawl was in prospect. Unfortunately, just as the soldiers reached him and were trying to haul him down, the coach moved out of vision, so I didn't see how it came out. The Duchess had seen it too, and we were no sooner at the palace than she summoned Schwerin to the ante-room where we were resting and pitched straight into him. Who was that agitator? How dared he raise his voice against me? And whose neglect allowed it to happen? Her voice was perfectly level, but she was obviously in a furious bate, and the old minister fairly cowered before the slip of the girl. Have he and his rabble been arrested? Schwerin wrung his hands. Highness, that this should have happened, it is deplorable. I do not know who the man was, but I will ascertain. I believe he was one of the socialist orators. Orator, says the Duchess, in a tone that would have frozen brandy. Revolutionary upstart. And on my wedding day. She turned to me. It is my shame, and my country's, that this affront should have taken place in your Highness's presence on this sacred occasion. Well, I didn't mind. I was more interested in her cold rage at what she conceived an affront to her noble dignity. She had a fine spoiled conceit of herself, to be sure. I suggested that the man was probably drunk, and that he'd done no harm anyway. Denmark must be fortunate in its security against such dangerous criminals, said she. In Strackens we find it prudent to take sterner measures against these orators. Schwerin, I hold you responsible. Let me hear presently that they have been arrested and punished. It would have sounded pompous from a bench of bishops. From a 19-year-old girl it was ridiculous, but I kept a straight face. I was learning fast about my little Irma, an imperious young piece. I found myself hoping that she would be thwarted of her vengeance on my big-headed revolutionary. Whoever he was, he had looked the kind of likely lad who would sooner spar with the peelers than eat his dinner, and keep things lively all round. When she had sent Schwerin packing, and her ladies had adjusted invisible flaws in her appearance, we proceeded with tremendous ceremony to the great ballroom, where the brilliant throng had already assembled for the reception. This is a bigger do than old Morrison gave for Elspeth and me in Paisley, thinks I, but I'll wager they can't drink more than those Scotch rascals did. The place was a blaze of splendid uniforms and gowns. Orders, medals, and jewellery twinkled everywhere. Aristocratic backs bent, and 100 skirts rustled in curtsies as we took our place on the dais for the guests to file by with their respectful congratulations. You never saw such a pack of noble toadies in your life, smirking their way past. They all fawned over the Duchess, of course, the square heads bowing stiffly, the Dagos bending double, for we had a fine selection from half the countries in Europe. After all, Duchess Irma was the cousin of our own Britannic Majesty, which made me sort of cousin-in-law to her and Albert, I suppose, and everyone wanted to have a grovel to us. I was delighted to see, though, that the British ambassador confined himself to a jerky little bow and "Felicitations, ma'am, and much happiness to both your highnesses." That's the style, thinks I. Good old England, and damn all foreigners. I just stood there nodding my head up and down until my neck creaked, smiling and murmuring my thanks to each passing face. Fat, thin, sweating, straining, smiling, adoring, they came in all sizes and expressions. And then Detchard's voice behind me whispered, "Henson," and I glanced sharply to see a fair-haired, long-jawed young fellow just straightening up from his bow to the Duchess. He turned to me, smiling expectantly, and in my sudden nervousness I took a step forward, grinning like a death's head, I shouldn't wonder, grabbed him by the hand and cried, "Eric, old friend, this is the most springing surprise of my happy day," or something equally garbled. I know that I bungled the words hopelessly, but he just laughed and pumped my hand. "Dear Karl, Highness, I had to come to wish you joy." He had that manly, sentimental look, misty-eyed yet smiling, which I personally can only manage in drink. "God bless you both." "God bless you too, old friend," says I, ringing hard at him, and then his smile faded, a puzzled look came into his eyes, and he stepped back. God knows I've had my bad moments, but seldom such a qualm of sickening dread as I experienced then. I kept my aching grin, because I was so paralyzed with panic that I couldn't move a muscle, waiting for the denunciation which I was certain was on his lips. For a second he stared, and then he made a sudden nervous gesture of apology and smiled again. "Pardon," he said. "Your pardon, Highness, Karl." He moved quickly aside to let in the next guest, bowed again, and then moved off towards the buffets, where the other guests were assembling. There I saw him turn, staring back at me, and presently he rubbed his brow with his fingers, gave his head a quick shake as a man will who is putting some trifle out of his mind, and gave his attention to a waiter who was proffering champagne. I knew I was crimson with the shock, and one knee was trembling violently, but I forced myself to smile steadily as the guest before me bobbed in a deep curtsy, and her escort swept me a bow. I saw the concern in their faces. When I turn red I'm a daunting sight, so I forced a laugh. "Forgive me," I told them. "I'm out of breath with saying thank you to several hundred people." They were delighted at being so familiarly addressed by royalty, and then the crisis was past, and I had time to steady myself. But it had been a horrible moment, and I must have gone through the rest of that reception like a man in a dream, for I can remember nothing more until I was back in my own room, alone with Detchard, Rudy, and de Gautet, drinking brandy from a glass that rattled against my teeth. "It was a bad moment," was Rudy's verdict. "For a second I thought we were gone. I had him covered from my pocket, and I swear if he had taken an instant longer to smile, I'd have shot him down and claimed he was preparing to assassinate you. And God knows what might have become of that. Phew! But he saw I wasn't the prince." I beat on the arm of my chair. "He saw through me, didn't he? You saw him, de Gautet, didn't he?" "I doubt it," says he. "For a moment he thought there was something strange about you, and then he told himself it was his own imagination. You saw him shake his head. He had tried to puzzle it out, but couldn't. No, he no more doubts you than he doubts himself." "By God, I hope so." I attacked the brandy again. "Suppose he thinks better of it, though, becomes suspicious." "He is being watched every moment he is in Strachens," says Rudy. "We have other reasons for keeping a sharp eye on Master Hansen." "What's that?" "Oh, his journey here wasn't only to dance at your wedding. We know that for months now he and other members of the Danish government have been in correspondence with the more militant Danish faction in Strachens, people like the Eider Danes over the border, only rather more dangerous. They watch everything German like hawks, hold secret meetings, that sort of thing. There's talk of a clandestine organization, the Sons of the Volsungs, dedicated to fly to arms in the event of any threat from Berlin to Strachensian independence." Rudy grinned pleasantly. "We'll settle with those gentlemen when the time comes. For the present, neither they nor friend Hansen need trouble you. The game's all but won, my boy." And he slapped me on the shoulder. "With the wedding behind us, there's nothing to do but to sit out the weeks until Otto gives the word that our good Carl Gustaf is ready to resume the role in which you are proving such a distinguished understudy. Then back to merry England for you, and let us hope that the delectable Irma isn't too disappointed in the change, shall we?" This was all very well, But I was by no means sure that the worst was past. I'd had some nasty turns in my brief life as Prince Carl Gustaf, and it seemed odds-on there being a few more before they'd sweated the clap out of him and he could succeed me on the consort's throne. And even then, would Bismarck keep faith? I didn't want to think about that just yet, but it was always at the back of my mind. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof, but you have to watch your step at night, too. I was still shaking with the Hansen business, and for that matter I was probably suffering from the strain of 2 days' imposture. At any rate, I punished a half-bottle of brandy there and then without noticeable effect, which is always a sign that the funks have got me good and proper. Rudy, although he watched me closely, whistling through his teeth, didn't say me nay. There was no further official business that day, only the drive to the hunting lodge at Strelhau, 10 miles from the city, and I didn't have to be stone-cold sober for that. We were to set out mid-afternoon, and presently Joseph and various minions were admitted to begin my preparations for the road. There was a great bustle as trunks and boxes were taken below stairs, and I was divested of my ceremonial uniform and kitted out in cutaway and topper, as befitted a gentleman bent on his honeymoon. I was sufficiently recovered from my nervous condition, or else the booze was beginning to work, to be able to discuss with Rudy the merits of checked or striped trousers, which had been the great debate among the London nobs that year. I was a checker myself, having the height and leg for it, but Rudy thought they looked bumpkinish, which only shows what damn queer taste they had in Austria in those days. Of course, if you'll put up with Metternich, you'll put up with anything. While we were talking, an officer of the Palace Guard put in an appearance with an escort carrying drawn sabres to collect the crown jewellery which Joseph had removed with my uniform. They had taken my coronet and state sword on our return from the cathedral, but my chain and rings remained, and these were now carefully stowed in velvet-lined cases and given to the guard to carry away. "Pretty things," says Rudy, cocking his cheroot thoughtfully between his teeth. "Where are you taking them, Fandrich?" "To the cloak-room, Herr Baron," says the young officer, clicking his heels. That's a strange place, surely. Wouldn't a dungeon be safer?" "If you please, Herr Baron, the cloak-room is at the top of the main tower of the palace. The tower has one stair which is under constant guard." The youth hesitated. "I believe they are kept there because in the old Duke's time it was his Grace's delight to visit the cloak-room every day and examine the state treasure." I was taking this in for what it was worth, and noting that Rudy von Starnberg was showing an uncommon interest in it too. Dishonest young pup. I knew what he was thinking. We left the palace on the stroke of 3, to be cheered out of town by the loyal Strakensians, who had been making the most of the free buffets and unlimited wine being dispensed in all the public buildings. The whole population seemed to be half shot, and the applause as we drove through the streets was abandoned and hilarious. I sat with the Duchess in an open landau, accompanied by Rudy and a strikingly pretty red-haired lady-in-waiting whose foot he kept stroking with his boot during the journey. Otherwise he was on his best behaviour, which meant that his conduct stopped just short of open insolence. However, Irma was in no frame of mind to notice. She was in something of a pet, chiefly, I gathered, because Schwerin had not been able to report the apprehension of the agitator who had been abusing us on our drive from the cathedral. And there had been difficulties with her trousseau, the people who were waving us good-bye were over-familiar in their expressions, the open carriage was not suitable for such a cold day, and so on. Every damn thing seemed to be wrong, for no obvious reason. To me it seemed that, whatever the rest of her trousseau was like, her blue travelling gown and fur hat à la hussar became her admirably. I said so, and she condescended to acknowledge the compliment, but very formally. We were still as distant as dowagers in church, and it struck me again that for all her prim composure she was probably quaking underneath. I found this gratifying, and resolved to let her stew in it for a while. I wasn't over-solicitous, and for most of the journey we rode on in silence. It was a sunny afternoon, and warm, in spite of Irma's complaint. The road from Strakenz runs through some splendid forest country, which encloses an unusual feature for that part of the world, in a short range of little crags and cliffs called the Jotun Gipfel. They're very pretty, very wild, as our late Queen would say, and rather like the English lake hills in miniature. Apart from a few shepherds' huts, they're fairly empty. Most of the inhabitants of Strakenz province living down in the flatlands near the city, but they contain one or two beautiful mountain tarns, in one of which stands the old castle of Jottunberg, which was the stronghold of the Dukes of Strakenz in the bad old days. It was kept now by the Bülow family, a Strakensian branch of the great German house of that name. The hunting lodge of Strelhau stands some miles from the Jotunn-Gipfel, tucked away in the woods a little distance off the main road. It has been the country seat of the ruling house for generations, and is an excellent little box, all rough timber and fir rugs, with fine open fires, leaded windows, comfortable appointments, and plenty of room. Altogether a bang-up place. We were travelling fairly informally. There were 2 Strakensian aides for me, apart from de Gotha and Rudy, and the Duchess had 3 ladies and about 5 maids. God knows why she needed all those. Detchard had come too, but elected to stay in the village. And of course I had Joseph with me. There were other servants and various grooms in attendance, and it looked like being quite a lively country party. And it was. Lively and deathly. We arrived at the lodge just before dusk. My bride was nervous and irritable, and had the servants who came out to greet us scurrying in all directions. There was a meal prepared in the panelled dining-room, with a cheery blaze in the grate, and all looking mighty snug and inviting, but she excused herself and went off above stairs with her lady-in-waiting and a cloud of lackeys hovering in her wake. However, we menfolk were sharp-set and fell on supper with a will, and after that the port and brandy, and before long we were making a good roaring evening of it. What with sensing that her haughty highness was out of sorts, and the food and wine, I was in excellent trim, and although de Gotha was his usual saturnine self, I was growing to loathe that sleek, silent smile. Rudy and the 2 Strakensians took their cue from me and caroused like cricketers. For all their other faults, I must own that Germans are excellent fellows at a gorging and drinking party. Rudy was in fine fettle, with his tunic undone and his curly hair a tumble, leading the singing in a capital baritone, but his eyes were still bright and clear. I doubt if he was ever the worse for drink in his life, that one. I was ladling the liquor down at a fair rate, and had just reached that state where I begin to search for mischief, when a footman brought down word that Her Grace the Duchess was about to retire, and requested that the disturbance of the evening should cease. At this the others fell silent. Rudy sat back in his chair and smiled into his glass. The Strakensians glanced uneasily at each other. I got to my feet, staggering a little and upsetting my chair, and said that if Her Grace was retiring, so was I. I bade them good night and walked, rather unsteadily, I imagine, to the door. One of the Strakensian aides jumps up and asked, could he help my highness? No, thank ye, my son, says I. I'm of age, you know. At which he fell back, blushing, and as I strode out, I heard Rudy laughing and calling out, Gentlemen, a toast! To Prince Carl Gustav, coupled, if you follow me, with Her Grace the Duchess of Strakens. I blundered upstairs, shed my clothes in my dressing-room, thrust Joseph out, threw on a gown, and strode through into the bedroom. I was full of booze and lewdness, and the sight of Irma, caught unawares, standing there in a white nightgown, did nothing to sober me. Her cold, proud beauty brought out the worst in me. I threw off the gown, and she shrieked and covered her eyes. Cheer up, little wife, says I. There won't be any more singing downstairs, and I stooped and whipped the nightdress clean off over her head. She gave a little cry, and since I maintain that the best way to deal with nervous females is to treat 'em hearty, I lifted her up bodily, popped her on, and stumped round the room, singing, This is the way the ladies ride, trit-trot, trit-trot, trit-trot. As near as I can remember, I sang it in English, but I doubt if she noticed. At all events, I know we finished the business on the bed, with me laughing weakly and babbling about hobbledy-hobbledy and down in a ditch, and assuring her that she was a damned fine duchess and a credit to her country. I suppose I dozed off, but I woke up and had at her again, and being slightly more sober by this time, I was aware that she lay still as a corpse, and didn't enter into the fun of the thing at all. If it had been any other woman, I'd have smartened her up with a few cuts across the rump, but with a duchess one ought to practise patience, I felt. And I was right, you see, because after that I went to sleep, leaving her lying there with her eyes closed like a beautiful ghost in the candlelight, and what should awaken me, I don't know how many hours later, but a tiny hand creeping across my thigh, and long hair snuggling up to my face, and I thought, well, damn me, royal or not, they're all alike under the skin. I was beat, I can tell you, but one must act like a gentleman, so I went to work again, and this time she clung like a leech. Just like Elspeth, I remember thinking, all chaste purity to look at, maidenly beauty personified, and randy as a monkey. I've known too many women, far too many, to claim to understand them. Their minds work in ways too mysterious for me to fathom. Anyway, my studies have generally been confined to their bodies, which perhaps accounts for it. But I know that Duchess Irma of Strackens was a different woman after that night. To me, at any rate. She had been a proud, autocratic, thoroughly spoiled little brat the day before, nervous as a mouse and cold as a whale's backside, and I'd not have been surprised if after the way I'd handled her she'd have been put off men for good. But next morning she was positively meek, in a thoughtful but apparently contented way, and very attentive to me. She seemed to be in a state of wonder almost, and yet she was ready to talk to me, and what was even more remarkable, listen to me too. Not that I'm a great hand at conversation in the mornings. I don't mention this in a boastful way, or to suggest that with a chap like me it's just a matter of catch 'em young, treat 'em rough, roger 'em hard, and they eat out of my hand. Far from it. I've used women that way and had them try to repay me with cold steel, or run a mile next time I looked at them. But with Irma, for some reason, it had quite the opposite effect. I can say that from that night on, as long as I knew her, she treated me with something near to worship. Which shows you how stupid a love-struck young woman can be. All this, of course, made for the most happy sojourn at Strelhau. There was plenty to do during the day, what with picnic parties, for although some snow still lay, it was pleasantly warm for the season, and shooting in the woods, and riding, on horses, in the afternoon, and in the evening we had musical entertainment from the ladies, or played billiards, and the food and drink were of the best. I began to feel like royalty again, with people waiting on me hand and foot and jumping to my slightest wish, and it is mighty pleasant to have a beautiful young duchess hanging on your arm, adoring you, even if she does keep you from getting much sleep at nights. It was the life, all right, lazing, feasting, shooting, tickling the pills in the billiard-room, and sweating it out in bed with Irma, all the trivial amusements that are simply nuts to chaps like me. Rudy and de Gautet were the only flies in the ointment, for their very presence was a constant jog to my memory of the business in hand. But, strangely enough, I became a little closer to de Gautet, for I discovered that he shared one of my chief interests, which is horseflesh. He was an authority of the true kind who never pretends more than he knows, and in the saddle he was nearly as good as I was myself, which is to say he would have been top-notch among any horsemen in the world, even the Cheyennes of the American plains, who are the best I know. We rode together a good deal, but I made sure we always had one of the Strackensians or a couple of grooms along. I'm nervous about going into the woods alone with fellows whom I've cut open with a Schlager, and who I'm pretty sure haven't forgotten it. De Gautet, at any rate, was a silent, unassertive fellow, which was more than could be said of the bold Rudy. Now that he was confident I could play my role in perfect safety, he was treating me exactly as he would have used the real Prince Karl, which is to say, with his customary impertinence. Of course he cared for no one, and he even let his bright eye play over Irma, while he would address her with that half-mocking deference which he seemed to reserve for his social superiors. She was woman enough to be taken by his good looks and easy charm, but she sensed, I think, that here was a real wrong-'un, and confessed to me on one occasion that she was sure he was not a gentleman. I promised to replace him with a new aide when we returned to the city, and took some malicious pleasure in telling him about it later, so that he could realize that one woman, at least, had read him correctly. But he was only amused. "I knew the chit had no taste," says he. "Why, she's taken to you. But don't imagine you can get rid of me so easily, your highness. I am your loyal, obedient, and ever-present servant, until the time comes to end our little comedy." He blew a smoke ring and eyed me tongue-in-cheek. "I think you'll be sorry when it's over, won't you? Princely life suits you, or I'm mistaken." In fact, he was mistaken. Oh, it was very idyllic there in Strelhau, and I was idler than even royalty usually are, but already I had a notion that the future that faced Carl Gustaf wasn't going to be all roses and wine. It may seem rare to be a crowned head, and no doubt if you're an absolute monarch with unlimited power it's right enough, but a prince consort, which is more or less what I was, isn't quite the same thing. He can't trim the heads off those he don't like, or order up any good-looking skirt who takes his fancy. He's always one step behind his adoring spouse, and even if she dotes on him, and who knows how long that will last, He still has to get his own way, if he wants it, through her good leave. Even in those blissful early days with Irma, I could see how it would be, and I didn't much like it. God knows how our late lamented Albert stuck it out, poor devil. If I'd been him, 6 months would have seen me on the boat back to Saxe-Coburg, or whatever it was. But perhaps he didn't mind playing second fiddle. He wasn't English. However, I consoled myself that I was having the best of both worlds. My luxurious enslavement was both enjoyable and temporary. Now and then I fretted a little over what the outcome of the comedy would be, but there was nothing to be done about it. Either Bismarck would keep his bargain or he wouldn't, and I forced myself to put the latter possibility out of my mind. This is the real coward's way, of course. I wanted to believe he would play fair, and so I did, even though common sense should have warned me that he wouldn't. And, as so often happens, I almost fell a prey to my own comfortable, lily-livered hopes. We had been about 10 days at Strelhau, I suppose, when one evening we were in the billiard-room, and the talk turned to horses. Someone, Rudy, I think, mentioned the fine stable kept by a gentleman over beyond the Jotun-Gipfel. I expressed interest, and it was suggested that next day we should ride over and call on him. It was all very easy and casual, like any of the other expeditions and picnics we had enjoyed, and I gave it no thought at all. So next morning de Gote and one of the Strackensian aides and I set off. The quickest way was through the Jotun-Gipfel on horseback, and Irma came with us by carriage as far as the road allowed. Thereafter we turned off towards the crags, she fluttering her handkerchief lovingly after her departing lord, and presently we were climbing into the hills by one of the bridle paths that are the only tracks through that wild and picturesque little region. It was a splendid day for such a jaunt, clear and sunny, and the scenery was pleasant. Any of our Victorian artists would have sketched it in a moment, with its nice little crags and trees and occasional waterfalls, and would have thrown in a couple of romantic shepherds with whiskers and fat calves for good measure. But we saw no one as we moved up towards the summit, and I was enjoying the ride and musing on last night's sporting with Irma, when the Strackensian aide's horse went lame. I've often wondered how they arranged that, for the horse was certainly lame, and I doubt if the aide, his name was Stoibel, just a boy, had anything to do with it. I cursed a bit, and de Gote suggested we turn and go back. The boy wouldn't hear of it. He would walk his horse slowly down to Strelhau, he said, and we should go on. De Gote looked doubtful. He was a clever actor, that one, but I was fool enough to agree. I can't think now how I was so green, but there it was. I never thought of foul play. I, who normally throw myself behind cover if someone breaks wind unexpectedly, was completely off guard. I had my pistols, to be sure, and even my knife, for I'd got into the wise habit of going armed whenever I left the lodge, but de Gote's manner must have disarmed me completely. We went on together, and about 20 minutes after parting from Stoibel, we had reached the summit. A pleasant little tree-fringed plateau, split by a deep gorge through which a river rushed, throwing up clouds of mist against the rocky sides. The whole tabletop was hemmed in by trees, but there was a clear patch of turf near the edge of the gorge, and here we dismounted to have a look down into the bottom, 100 feet below. I don't care for heights, but the scene was so pleasant and peaceful that I never felt a moment's unease, until de Gote spoke. "The Jotun-Schlucht," says he, meaning the gorge, and something in his voice sounded the alarm in my brain. It may have been the flatness of his tone, or the fact that he was closer behind me than I felt he should have been, but with the instinct of pure panic I threw myself sideways on the turf, turning as I fell to try and face him. If his pistol hadn't misfired, he would have got me. I heard the click even as I moved, and realized that he had been aiming point-blank at my back. As I tried to scramble up, he dropped it with an oath, drew its mate from beneath his tunic, and levelled it at me. I screamed, "No, no!" as he thumbed back the lock, and he hesitated a split second to see if I should leap again, and to make sure of his aim. In a novel, of course, or a play, murders are not committed so. The villain leers and gloats, and the victim pleads. In my practical experience, however, killing gentlemen like de Gote are far too practised for such nonsense. They shoot suddenly and cleanly, and the job's done. I knew I had perhaps a heartbeat between me and damnation, and in sheer terror I snatched the seaman's knife from the top of my boot and hurled it at him with all my force, sprawling down again as I did so. If I've had more than my share of bad luck in my life, I've had some good to make up for it. I had some now. The knife only hit him butt first on the leg, but it caused him to take a quick step back. His heel caught on a stone or tuft, he overbalanced, the pistol cracked, the ball went somewhere above my head, and then I was on top of him, smashing blindly with my fists, knees, and anything else, trying to beat him into the ground. He was tall and active, but nothing like my weight, and fleshy in the grip of mortal fear, with nowhere to run to and no choice but to fight, is probably a dreadful opponent. I was roaring at the top of my voice and clawing at him for dear life. He managed to shove me off once, but he made the error of lunging for the fallen knife, and I was able to get one solid, full-blown boot against the side of his head. He groaned and fell back, his eyes rolling up in his head, and collapsed limply on the turf. For a moment I thought I'd killed him, but I didn't wait about to see. The training of years asserted itself, and I turned, bolted headlong down the path, with no thought but to put as much distance as I could between me and the scene of possible danger. Before I'd gone far, I'd stopped to be sick, no doubt from the shock of my narrow escape, and during the pause I had time to consider what I was doing. Where could I run to? Not back to Strelhau, for certain. The Bismarck gang had shown their hand now, and my life wouldn't be worth a China orange if I went anywhere they could come at me. And why had they tried to kill me now? What purpose was there in having me dead before the real Carl Gustaf was ready to take my place? Maybe he was ready, although if he'd been rotten with pox they'd tidied him up mighty quick. Or had Bismarck's whole tale been pure moonshine? Maybe Carl Gustaf was dead. Maybe 1,000 things I had no way of knowing. As I think I've said before, while fear usually takes control of my limbs, particularly my running equipment, it seldom prevents me from thinking clearly. Even as I stood there spewing, I knew what had to be done. It was essential that I make tracks out of Strackens at once. But reason told me that to do that in safety I must have a clear notion of what my enemies were up to, and the only man who could tell me that was de Gotha, if he was still alive. The longer I hesitated, the longer he had to revive. My pistols were in my saddle holsters at the summit, so back up the track I went at full speed, pausing only near the top to have a stealthy skulk and see how the land lay. The horses had gone, scared no doubt by the pistol shot, but de Gotha was still where I'd left him. Was he shamming? It would have been like the foxy bastard, so I lay low and watched him. He didn't stir, so I tossed a stone at him. It hit him, but he didn't move. Reassured, I broke cover, snatched up the knife, and crouched, panting, beside him. He was dead to the world, but breathing, with a fine red lump on his skull. In a moment I had his belt off and trussed his elbows with it. Then I pulled off his boots, secured his ankles with my own belt, and felt comfortably safer. Several excellent ideas were already forming in my mind about how to deal with Master de Gotha when he came to, and I waited with a pleasant sense of anticipation. He had a hole in one sock, I noticed. There would be holes in more than that before I'd finished with the murderous swine. Presently he groaned and opened his eyes, and I had the pleasure of watching his expression show bewilderment, rage, and fear all in turn. "Well, de Gotha," says I, "what have you got to say, you back-shooting rat, you?" He stayed mum, glaring at me. So I tickled him up with a knife, and he gasped and cursed. "That's it," says I, "get some practice. And see here, I'm not going to waste time with you. I'm going to ask questions, and you'll answer 'em smartly, d'you see? Because if you don't, well, I'll show you the advantages of an English public school education, that's all. Now, first, why did you try to kill me? What are you and our good friend Otto Bismarck up to?" He struggled, but saw it was no go, and lay still. "You will learn nothing from me," says he. "Your error," says I. "See here." By good luck I had a piece of string with me, which I looped over 2 of his toes, placing a nice sharp pebble in between them. I put a stick through the loop and twisted it a little. It always used to liven the rugby fags up, although of course one couldn't go too far with them, and de Gotha's response was gratifying. He squealed and writhed, but I held his legs down easily. "You see, my boy," says I, "you'd better open your potato trap, or it'll be the worse for you." "You villain!" cries he, sweating with fear. "Is this how you treat a gentleman?" "No," says I, enjoying myself. "It's how I treat a dirty, cowardly, murdering ruffian." And I twisted the stick hard. He screamed, but I kept on twisting, and his yells were such that I had to stuff my glove in his mouth to quiet him. I had no real fear of interruption, for he had been at such pains to get me alone that I doubted if any of his precious friends were in the district, but it seemed best to keep him as mum as possible. "Nod your head when you've had enough, Dagote," says I cheerfully. "When I've broken all your toes, I'll show you how the Afghan ladies treat their husbands' prisoners." And I went back to work on him. I confess that I thoroughly enjoyed it, as only a true coward can, for only a coward and bully really understands how terrible pain can be. Dagote wasn't much braver than I am. A few more twists and he was jerking his head up and down like Punch, and for some reason this put me in a great fury. I gave him a few more twists for luck, until the string broke. Then I pulled the gag out. He was groaning and calling me filthy names, so I taught him manners with the point of the knife in his leg. "Now, you bastard, why did you try to kill me?" "It was the Baron's order." "Ah, dear God!" "Never mind God, what for? What about my £10,000, damn you?" It was never intended that you would be paid." "You mean I was to be murdered from the start, is that it?" He rolled over, moaning and licking his lips, looking at me with terror in his eyes. "If I tell you all, oh, my feet! If I tell you, do you swear, on your honour as a gentleman, to let me go?" "Why should I? You'll tell me anyway." "Oh, all right then, on my honour as a gentleman. Now then." But he insisted that I swear on my mother's memory, too. What he thought all that swearing was worth, I can't imagine, but he wasn't feeling himself, I dare say, and foreigners tend to take an Englishman's word when he gives it. That's all they know. So I swore his oaths, and it all came tumbling out. The Prince Carl Gustaf hadn't had pox at all. He was clean as an old bone. But Bismarck had plotted with Detchard to spirit him away and put me in his place, as they had indeed done. The pox story had simply been an excuse for my benefit. And if it seems ludicrously thin now, I can only assert that it seemed damn convincing coming from Bismarck in his lonely stronghold, with Krafstein waiting to fillet me if I didn't believe it. Anyway, their little plan was that after a few days, when Strackens was convinced it had got a genuine consort for its duchess, I was to be murdered in the Jotun Gipfel, and Dagote was to vanish over the German border. There would be a hue and cry, and my body would be found and carried back to Strackens amid general consternation. And then, wonder of wonders, papers would be found in my clothing to suggest I wasn't Prince Carl at all, but a daring English impostor called Flashman, an agent of Lord Palmerston, if you please, and up to God knows what mischief against the security and well-being of the Duchy of Strackens. There would be chaos and confusion, and a diplomatic upheaval of unprecedented proportions. I couldn't take it in at first. "You bloody liar! Do you expect me to believe this cock and bull? For that matter, who in the world would credit it?" "Everyone." His face was working with pain. "You are not the prince. You would be identified for what you really are, even if it took time. Witnesses who knew you could be brought. Who would doubt it? It is true." My brain was reeling. But in God's name, what for? What could Bismarck gain from all this? The discredit of England? Your Lord Palmerston? Utter bewilderment and rage in Strackens? Dane and German are on a knife-edge here. There would be bloodshed and disorder. That is what the Baron wants. Ah, Herrgott, my feet are on fire. Damn your feet! Why the hell does he want bloodshed and disorder? As a pretext. You know that Strackens and Schleswig and Holstein are bitterly divided between Dane and German. Disorder in one would spread to the others. The old rivalry between Berlin and Copenhagen would be fanned into flame. For the sake of German interest, Berlin would march into Strackens, then into the other two. Who could stop her? It is only the excuse that is lacking. And how would my murder be explained in God's name? It would not need explaining. That you were an English agent, that would be enough. Well, that seemed the silliest bit of all to me, and I said so. Who was going to buy me as an agent? Feel the lining of your tunic. On the right side. For all his pain, he couldn't keep a grin of triumph off his face. It is there. Feel. By God, it was. I ripped out the lining with my knife, and there was a paper, covered in tiny cryptograms. God knows what they meant, but knowing Bismarck, I'll wager it was good, sound, incriminating stuff. I sat gazing at it, trying to understand what Dagote had been telling me. "It has all been exactly planned," says he. "It could not fail. Confusion and riot must follow on your death, and Germany would seize the opportunity to march." I was trying vainly to make sense of the whole incredible scheme, and to find a flaw in it. Hold on," says I. "This is all very fine, but just because Bismarck has fine ideas about marching into Strackens, that don't mean a thing." There's a government in Berlin, I believe. Suppose they don't share in his martial ardour, what then? But it is planned, I tell you, cries he. He has friends, men of power in high places. It is concerted, and when the chance comes in Strackens, they will act as he says. He can force the thing. He has division. Das Genie. Aye, perhaps he had the genius. Now, of course, I know that he could have done it. I doubt if there was any diplomatic coup that brilliant, warped intelligence couldn't have brought off. For all that he was the most dreadful bastard who ever sat in a chancellery, he was the greatest statesman of our time. Yes, he could have done it. He did, didn't he, in the end? And where is Strackens now? Like Schleswig and Holstein, it is buried in the German Empire that Otto Bismarck built. It was just my bad luck that I had been cast through the sheer chance of an uncanny resemblance to be the first foundation stone of his great dream. This was to be his initial step to power, the opening move in his great game to unify Germany and make it first of the world's states. Squatting there on the damp turf of the Jottengipfel, I saw that the crazy scheme in which he had involved me had a flawless logic of its own. All he needed was something to strike a spark in Strackens, and I was the tinder. Thereafter, with him gently guiding from the wings, the tragic farce could run its course. De Gautet groaned, and brought me back to earth. He was lying there, this foul brute who would have put a bullet in my back, aye, and had already planted his sabre cuts in my skull. In a rage I kicked him. This was the pass that he and his damned friends had brought me to, I shouted, stranded in the middle of their blasted country, incriminated, helpless, certain to be either murdered by Bismarck's crew or hanged by the authorities. He roared and pleaded with me to stop. "Aye, you can howl now," says I. "You were ready enough an hour ago to show me no mercy, curse you." A thought struck me. I don't suppose you showed any to that poor Danish sod either. Where's Carl Gustaf, then? Lying somewhere with his throat cut and a letter in his pocket saying, "A present from Flashy and Lord Palmerston"? No, he is alive, I swear it. He is being kept safe. What for? What use is he to bloody Bismarck? He was not to be. Nothing was to befall him until I'd had my weasand slit. That's it, isn't it? You dirty dogs, you. Where is he, then, if he's still alive? At first he wouldn't say, but when I flourished the knife at him, he changed his mind. In Jottenberg, the old castle of the Duke, yonder over the crags, in the Jottensee. I swear 'tis true. He is under guard there, he knows nothing. The Baron leaves nothing to chance. If aught had gone wrong, he might have been needed alive. You callous hound. And otherwise he would have got a bullet too, eh? I had to give him some more toe leather before he would answer, but when he did, it was in some detail. To ensure that no mischance should lead to his being rescued, Carl Gustaf was in a dungeon in the castle, with a handy shaft in its floor that came out somewhere under the Jottensee. His body would never be found once they popped him down there, which they would certainly do once they heard that my corpse had been delivered back to Strackens, and the uproar over my identity was going nicely. Well, it looked bad for Carl Gustaf in any event. Not that it was any concern of mine, but it helped to fan my righteous indignation, which was powerful enough on my own behalf, I can tell you. "De Gautet," says I, "you're a foul creature. You don't deserve to live another minute." "You swore," he babbled, struggling in his bonds. "You gave me your solemn promise." "So I did," says I. "To let you go, wasn't it? Well, I will. Come along, let's have you up." I dragged him to his feet and took my belt from round his ankles. He could hardly stand with the pain of his toes, and I had to support him. "Now, De Gautet," says I, "I'm going to let you go. But where, eh? That's the point, ain't it?" "What do you mean?" His eyes were staring with fear. "You promised." "So did Bismarck. So did you. You're a dirty creature, De Gautet. I think you need a wash." I propelled him to the edge of the precipice and held him for a second. "I'll let you go, all right, you murderous cur. Down there." He let out a shriek you could have heard in Munich, and tried to wrench free, but I held him fast and let him look, just to let him know he was really going to die. Then I said, "Gehen Sie weg, De Gautet," and gave him a push. For an instant he tottered on the brink, trying to keep his balance, and screaming hoarsely. Then he fell out and down, and I watched him turn slowly over in the air, crash onto the jutting rocks halfway down the cliff, and spin outwards like a rag doll with his legs waving, before he vanished into the spray at the precipice foot. It was an interesting sight. I killed before, of course, although never in what you might call cold blood, but I've never felt anything but satisfaction over the end of de Gautet. He deserved to die, if anyone ever did. He was a heartless, cruel rascal, and I'd have been lucky to come off as easily if things had been the other way round. I'm not justifying myself either for torturing him or killing him, for I don't need to. Both had to be done, but I'm honest enough to admit I enjoyed doing them. He was a good horseman, though. However, his death, though first-rate in its way, solved nothing as far as my immediate comfort and safety were concerned. I was still in the very devil of a pickle, I realized, as I gazed round the empty clearing and tried to decide what to do next. It was certain that de Gautet had arranged some means of getting word quickly to Rudy and Co. to say that Flashy was a goner and all was well. How long would it be before they realized something had gone wrong? An hour or two? A day? I must assume it would be sooner rather than later, and then the hunt would be up with a vengeance, with me as the poor little fox. I had to get out of Strackens at once. But where to? These thoughts put me into a blue funk, of course, and I paced up and down that summit, muttering, where, oh, Jesus, how can I get out of this? Then I steadied up, telling myself that when you've been hounded by Afghans and come safe home, you need hardly take the vapours over a pack of Germans. Which is just rubbish, of course, as I assured myself a second later. One's as beastly dangerous as the other. Still, this was a comparatively civilized country. I spoke the language tolerably, and I'd had enough experience of skulking, surely, to get me out of it. I hadn't a horse, and only a knife for protection. De Gautet's empty pistols were useless, but the first thing was to get down from the Jotun Gipfel and plot my course as I went. Before starting out, I burned the incriminating papers they had sewn in my tunic. Then I took to the woods at right angles from the path we'd been following, scrambled down over mossy rocks and through thick brushwood. It wasn't easy going, but I was too busy with my thoughts to notice much. One point stuck clear in my mind, and it was the advice given by the late-lamented Sergeant Hudson when he and I were on the run from the Afridis on the Jalalabad road. When the bastards are after you, go in the direction where they'll never think of looking for you, even if it's right back in their faces. Well, I wasn't going to Strelhau. That was flat. But if I was Bismarck or Rudy, where would I expect Flashy to run? North for certain, towards the coast, less than 100 miles away. So that was out of court. Of the other directions, which was the least likely for a fugitive? All were hazardous, since they would take me long journeys through Germany, but south seemed the most dangerous of all. By God, the last place they would expect me to make for was Munich, at the far end of the country, where all the bother had begun. My legs trembled at the thought, but the more I considered it, the better it seemed. They'd never believe I'd risk it, so they wouldn't look there anyway. It was horribly chancy, but I was certain that if Hudson had been with me, that was the way he'd have pointed. Let me get a horse, no matter how, and I could be over the Strackens border by nightfall and galloping south. I'd have to beg, hire, borrow, or steal. Changes on the way, well, it wouldn't be the first time. I might even use the railway, if it seemed safe to do so. At any rate, I was free for the moment, and if they could catch old Flashy, with the wind up him, well, they were smarter fellows than I thought they were. I hurried on down the hillside, and found myself after half an hour or so on more level land, where the trees thinned out. There was a wisp of smoke coming from behind a copse, and I stole forward cautiously to have a look-see. There was a little farm building, with great trees behind it, but no one about except a few cows in the field to one side, and an old dog drowsing in the yard. It didn't look the kind of place where the new ducal consort of Strackens would be known, which suited me. The fewer folk who got a glimpse of me, the less chance Bismarck's bullies had of getting on my track. I was wondering whether to go forward boldly or scout round for a horse to pinch, when the farm door opened and an old man in gaiters and a sugar-loaf hat came out. He was a peasant, with a face like a walnut, and when he saw me he brought up short and stood glowering at me, the way country folk do at everyone who hasn't got dung on his boots. I gave him a civil good day, and told him my horse had thrown me while I was riding in the Jotun Gipfel. Could he oblige me with a remount, for which I would pay generously? And I showed him a handful of crowns. He mumbled a bit, watching me with the wary, hostile eyes of the old, and then said that his daughter was in the house. She turned out to be a big, strapping creature, plain enough in the face, but just about my weight, so I gave her my best bow, and repeated my request with a charming smile. The long and the short of it was that they sat me down in the kitchen with some excellent beer and bread and cheese, while the old man went off round the house, and presently came back to say that Franz had gone to find Willy, who would be able to borrow Wolf's horse, no doubt, and if the gentleman would be pleased to rest and eat, it would be along in a little while. I was happy enough with this, for neither of them seemed to have any notion of who I was, or rather who I was supposed to be, and it gave me the chance to get something under my belt. They were both a little in awe, though, at having such a fine gentleman in their humble home, and seemed too tongue-tied to say much. If the dotard hadn't been there, I dare say I could have had the buxom piece dancing the mattress quadrille within the hour, but as it was, I had to confine my refreshment to the victuals and beer. After an hour had passed, though, I began to get restless. I'd no wish to linger here, with Rudy possibly combing the Jotun Gipfel for me already, and when a second hour passed, and then a third, I became feverish. The old clod kept assuring me, in answer to my impatient demands, that Wolf or Franz or Willy would soon be along with the horse, an excellent horse, he added. And there seemed to be nothing to do but wait, chewing my nails, while the old man sat silent, and the woman went very soft-footed about her work. It was 4 hours before they came, and they didn't have a horse. What they did have, though, was weapons. There were 4 of them, hefty lads in peasant clothes, but with a purposeful look about them that suggested that they didn't give all their time to ploughing. 2 had muskets, another had a pistol in his belt, and the leader, who was a blond giant at least a head taller than I, had a broadsword, no less, hanging at his side. I was on my feet, quaking at the sight of them, but the big fellow held up a hand and made me a jerky bow. "Highness," says he, and the others bobbed their heads behind him. My bald head was evidently better known than I'd realized. Uneasily I tried to put on a bold front. "Well, my lad," says I cheerfully, "have you a horse for me?" "No, Highness," says the big one, "but if you will please to come with us, my master will attend to all your needs." I didn't like the sound of this, somehow. "Who is your master, then?" "If you please, Highness, I am to ask you only to come with us. Please, Highness." He was civil enough, but I didn't like it. "I want a horse, my good fellow, not to see your master. You know who I am, it seems. Well, bring me a horse directly." "Please, Highness," he repeated stolidly, "you will come with us. My master commands." At this I became very princely and peremptory, but it didn't do a straw's worth of good. He just stood there insisting, and my bowels went more chilly every moment. I hectored and stormed and threatened, but in the end there was nothing for it. I went with them, leaving the farm couple round-eyed behind us. To my consternation they led me straight back towards the Jotun Gipfel, but although I protested, they held their course, the big fellow turning every now and then to mutter apologies, while his pals kept their muskets handy and their eyes carefully on me. I was beside myself with fright and anger. Who the devil were they, I demanded, and where was I being taken? But not a word of sense was to be had from them, and the only consolation I could take was a vague feeling that whoever they were, they weren't Rudy's creatures, and didn't seem to mean me any harm, as yet. How far we tramped I don't know, but it must have taken fully 2 hours. I wouldn't have believed the Jotun Gipfel was so extensive or so dense, but we seemed to be moving into deeper forest all the time along the foot of the crags. The sun was westering, so far as I could judge, when I saw people ahead, and then we were in a little clearing with perhaps a dozen fellows waiting for us, stalwart peasants like my 4 guards, and all of them armed. There was a little cabin half hidden among the bushes at the foot of a small cliff that ran up into the overhanging forest, and before the cabin stood 2 men. One was a tall, slender, serious-looking chap, dressed like a quality lawyer, and grotesquely out of place here. The other was burly and short, in a corduroy suit and leggings, the picture of a country squire or retired military man. He had grizzled, close-cropped hair, a bulldog face, and a black patch over one eye. He was smoking a pipe. They stood staring at me, and then the tall one turned and said urgently to his companion, "He is wrong. I am sure he is wrong." The other knocked out his pipe in his hand. "Perhaps," says he. "Perhaps not." He took a step towards me. "May I ask you, sir, what is your name?" There was only one answer to that. I took a deep breath, looked down my nose, and said, I think you know it very well. I am Prince Carl Gustaf, and I think I may be entitled to ask, gentlemen, who you may be, and what is the explanation of this outrage?" For a man with his heart in his mouth, I think I played it well. At any rate, the tall one said excitedly, "You see, it could not be otherwise. Highness, may I—" "Save your apologies, Doctor," says the short one. "They may be in order, or they may not." To me he went on, "Sir, we find ourselves in a quandary. I hear you say who you are. Well, my name is Zapten, and this is Dr. Per Grundvig of Strakans. Now, may I ask what brings you to Jotungypfel, with your coat muddied and your breeches torn?" "You ask a good deal, sir," says I hotly. "Must I remind you who I am, and that your questions are an impertinence? Aye, it sounds like the real thing," says Zapten, smiling a grim little smile. "Well, we'll see." He turned his head. "Hansen, step this way, if you please." And out of the hut, before my horrified gaze, stepped the young man who had greeted me at the wedding reception. Erik Hansen, Carl Gustaf's boyhood friend. I felt my senses start to swim with sick terror. He had sensed something wrong then. He couldn't fail to unmask me now. I watched him through a haze as he walked steadily up to me and gazed intently at my face. "Prince Carl?" he said at last. "Carl? Is that you? Is it really you?" I forced myself to try to smile. "Erik!" God, what a croak it was. "Why, Erik, what brings you here?" He stepped back, his face white, his hands trembling. He looked from Zapten to the doctor, shaking his head. "Gentlemen, I don't know. It's he, and yet I don't know." "Try him in Danish," says Zapten, his single grey eye fixed on me. I knew then I was done for. Personin's efforts had been insufficient to give me more than the crudest grasp of one of the hardest tongues in Europe. It must have shown in my face as Erik turned back to me, for the damned old villain Zapten added, "Ask him something difficult." Erik thought for a moment, and then, with an almost pleading look in his eyes, spoke in the soft, slipshod mutter that had baffled my ear at Schönhausen. I caught the words, "Vor Borgia," and hardly anything else. Christ, he wanted to know where somebody lived, God knows who. Desperately I said, "Jeg forstår ikke," to show that I didn't understand, and it sounded so hellish flat I could have burst into tears. Slowly an ugly look came over his fair young face. "No," he said slowly. "De forstår mig ikke." He turned to them and said in a voice that shook, "He may be the devil himself. It is the prince's face and body, but it is not Carl Gustaf. My life on it." There wasn't a sound in the clearing except for my own croaking breaths. Then Zapten put his pipe in his pocket. "So," says he, "right, my lad, into that hut with you, and if you make a wrong move, you're with your maker. Jacob," he shouted, "sling a noose over the branch yonder.